Good morning, everybody. Thought that as a starting point we might think about some of those things that Paul suggested were a product of the Spirit. Just reading from Galatians 5 verse 22, "But the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness and self-control. Against such things there is no law." Just want to concentrate on two of them for the moment, particularly kindness and gentleness. They're not synonymous with love, and they can unfortunately sometimes be hard to find in conversation, particularly when people have got differences of opinion. I know myself, I look back, sometimes I have such a strong opinion on something, I hold it so passionately, that my defence sometimes lacks those qualities of kindness and gentleness. And I just want to spend a little bit of time this morning thinking about some examples of that. The last time I gave a full sermon from this platform, I talked about forgiveness. And perversely enough, I chose to look at somebody who couldn't forgive. And we traced through the life of someone whose unforgiveness in his life eventually destroyed him. He was so unforgiving of something that happened that eventually, 15 years after the event that he couldn't forgive, he eventually died from the bitterness that caused in his heart. And that man, of course, was Ahithophel, who could not forgive David for what he had done to his granddaughter. Sometimes I think maybe I shouldn't have concentrated on the negative, the person who couldn't forgive. But perversely, I'm going to do it again. We'll look at some occasions of where, in fact, it was the lack of gentleness and the lack of kindness that resulted in events which could have been avoided. The first example I have done in Bible class before, so I do apologise if anybody finds this repetitive, but then again I think I might flatter myself that anyone might remember what was said at Bible class. Anyway, I'll go ahead. I sometimes wonder whether in the kingdom of God we will apologise to people that we've hurt. Times when we thought we were so right, and we'll find out eventually that we were so wrong. I don't think so. I don't think we'll need to apologise then, but if we did, I'd imagine the whole millennium would be taken up with apologies. There are so many times we must have thought that we were so right, but turned out to be so wrong. And this morning, I want to particularly talk about David and Michal. I can imagine in the kingdom David falling on his knees and begging his wife for forgiveness for the great evil that he had done to her. And I want to talk for a small time about that evil and see how it could have been avoided. It could have been avoided if David's pride and all of the hurtful parts of his nature had not inflicted all of this torture on his wife. As soon as you talk about Michal, this first wife of David, I think probably all of us, our mind goes to 2 Samuel 6, when David was bringing the ark into Jerusalem. And it was coming in. He was extremely excited. He was dancing in front of the ark. He was wearing a linen ephod, and I don't know why. I thought an ephod was a priestly garment, but what do I know? Anyway, he was dancing there in the ephod and apparently bearing more of his body than he should have. Because Michal, looking out from the window, despised him in her heart, and she said, "What a fool you made of yourself today, David. Out there dancing around, half naked in front of the slave girls." And that tends to be the picture we have of Michal, and that tends to be what remains in our mind. That's the end of a long story. That was the end of great wickedness that David had inflicted upon her. And I certainly find I can well understand why she despised him in her heart. And that happened well before that event. Let's go back in the story, 1 Samuel 18. Michal fell in love with David. David was in the household of Saul a lot, and she would have seen a lot of him. I don't know why she fell in love with him. He was handsome, a soldier, best guitar player in the land, great poet. I don't know why she fell for him. What wasn't to love in David? Everything a girl could want, I'd imagine. I can certainly look back on the days when I was alive and thought, I certainly wish I could play the guitar like some of the other lads. But there you go. I presume that was what attracted her in the first place, plus probably his godliness. When Saul realised that the Lord was with David and that his daughter loved David, that's just one of the verses, verse 28 from that chapter, Saul realised that she was in love with David. And then in verse 26, when the attendants told David these things, he was pleased to become the king's son-in-law. In other words, David was also happy to marry Michal. I assume that that means he was in love with her. I don't know. But he was certainly willing to marry her. Remember that she was bought at the expense of risking David's life. When King Saul had offered his daughter Merab to David, David said, well, what am I that I should get the king's daughter? In those days there was a bride price to be paid. And I presume the bride price of the king's daughter was pretty high. And there seemed to be some sort of equivocation or something with the wedding of Merab, but she was wed to somebody else. And the second daughter was then offered to David, Michal. And David said, I can't afford the bride price. To buy the daughter of a king would have been at great expense. But Saul said, no, don't worry about that. I don't want any money. I just want you to go and kill 100 Philistines and bring me bits of their bodies. And David, well, he could have backed out then. He could have said, no, I'm not going to do that. But he didn't. Straight away, it pleased him to become the king's son-in-law. And he went and not only killed 100, but 200 Philistines and brought bits of their bodies back. Which does seem a rather odd thing, but it does seem that he put his life on the line for Michal. It seems as though they certainly, at that stage, were in love with each other. Then, of course, Saul turns against David. The very reason he sent him to kill 100 Philistines was in the hope that David, might be killed by the Philistines. One man against 100, you sort of put your bet on the 100. But it didn't work out for Saul, and even, as I said, he killed 200. And so it would seem then that David not only loved Michal, but that Saul had used this wedding as a part of his plot to kill David. So David went back to his home, and it's just a matter of interest, perhaps this is just a sidelight. Saul wanted to use the Philistines to kill David. Because he hated David and saw David as a threat, he wanted to use the Philistines as an instrument to kill the man he wanted to get rid of. Does that ring a bell to you? It's exactly what David did. David sent Uriah into the midst of the battle and withdrew in the deliberate attempt to have Uriah killed. And it worked. But it just seems strange to me that this didn't turn David off from doing what he later did. So King Saul decides to kill him. He's now in his house with Michal. And in 1 Samuel 19, we read, that night David made good his escape. Saul sent men to David's house to kill him in the morning, but Michal, David's wife, warned him, if you don't run for your life tonight, tomorrow you'll be killed. So Michal let David down through a window, and he fled and escaped. Then Michal took an idol and laid it in the bed, covered it with a garment, putting some goat's hair at its head. Then Saul sent men back to see David and told them, bring him up to me in his bed so that I might kill him. And when the men entered, there was the idol in the bed, and at the head was some goat's hair. Saul said to Michal, why did you deceive me like this and send my enemy away so that he would have escaped? Michal told him, he said to me, let me go away, why should I kill you? So Saul was angry at his daughter because he had let David escape. But she, of course, made up the excuse, well, look, David was going to kill me. If I didn't let him escape, he was going to make sure that I died as well, to appease her father's wrath. A couple of curious things in that episode. Michal put her life on the line. It wasn't a small thing to support David in the face of Saul. I'll come across a moment when he tried to kill his own son, the son and heir to the kingdom. He tried to kill him because he supported David. But one curious thing, have you ever noticed reading that story that there was an idol in the house? Perhaps a teraphim? What was that doing in David's house? Saul would even kill his own children. Such was his hatred of David. There was a time when he tried to kill Jonathan. Because Jonathan supported David, Jonathan said to him, "Why should he be put to death? What has he done?" Jonathan asked this of his father, but Saul hurled his spear at him to kill him. Then Jonathan knew that his father intended to kill David. What that means is the hatred of Saul was so great that it overcame the love of his children. Jonathan was not only his son, but was the heir to the kingdom, and yet he was prepared to kill him because he supported David. How much more would he have killed his daughter? Girls weren't as important as boys back in those days. How much more would his hatred have been taken out on Michal if he thought that she had really turned her back on him? Then, of course, David flees. He's away for years now. David and Michal are now separate. 1 Samuel 25, we read that David marries Abigail. He'd already married Ahinoam of Jezreel. So he's got two more wives. 2 Samuel 3 tells us he not only married Ahinoam, but Abigail, but Maacah, but Haggith, Abital, and Eglah. He's got 6 wives now. He's also got all Saul's wives and concubines. When God was cross with David for what he had done to Uriah in taking Bathsheba, God said, "Didn't I give you all the wives of the house of Saul and all his concubines?" Now, I don't know how many that makes, but I'm guessing that Saul probably had something like 18 or 20 wives and concubines. David's already got 6, so now he's got 25 or something like that. And then there's a great civil war. Saul is killed on Mount Gilboa. The whole country now divides. Those who wanted to support the house of Saul, Jonathan's dead as well, so those who wanted to put the remaining sons of Saul on the throne, they have a war with David and his house. And bit by bit, the household of Saul begins to lose power. They are defeated. Their great champion was Abner, fighting against Joab, who was the commander-in-chief of David's forces. And eventually they began to lose. These armies of Saul began to lose. And then there was a nasty story made up about Abner, one that was completely false, but it was accused he'd gone into one of Saul's concubines and had sex with her. Not true. But a lot of people believed it, and Abner got pretty cheesed off about this, and he thought, well, I'm not going to fight for people who think that about me. And so he came to David and he said, I'm going to join you. I'm going to take all of Saul's soldiers over to you, and you'll win the war straight away because they'll have no one else to fight with. Reading from 1 Samuel 3, then Abner sent messages to David, and that was to say that he was willing to come over and join David. Good, David said. I will make an agreement with you, but I demand one thing of you. Do not come into my presence unless you bring Michal, the daughter of Saul, when you come. Then David sent messages to Ishbosheth, the son of Saul, demanding, give me my wife Michal, whom I betrothed to myself. So Ishbosheth gave orders and had her taken away from her husband, Paltiel. Her husband, however, went after her, weeping behind her, all the way to Bahurim. Then Abner said to him, go back home. And he went home. And I suspect that we just get the short version. I'm pretty sure he said, go back home if you want to keep your head on your shoulders. And so Paltiel goes back home. He went after her weeping. Saul had already given Michal to another man. Saul had already figured that David was a dead man. He knew that whenever he caught David, he'd be dead. And so Saul figured that his daughter was a widow now. So she was married off to Paltiel. But it was absolutely clear that they had a relationship. Paltiel and Michal were now a pair. Illegitimate maybe, but they were a pair. And what does David demand? He's already got 20-odd wives, but he demands his first wife. Because he loves her? Not in your life. I wonder what Jesus would have done. Just imagine if Jesus had come across a woman who had left her husband and was living with another man. I think he would have said to her, go back to the village and get your husband. And I think she would have said, I don't have a husband. And I think Jesus would have said, you're right. You've had 5 husbands and the one you have now is not your own. Did he demand that she went back to the first husband? Did he say to her, I'm not going to give you the gospel until you go back to your rightful husband, number 1? No. He gave her love and grace, made no demands on her. In fact, it was the first time that he revealed his messiahship was to this Samaritan woman who had left her husband and was living with another man. The first time he confessed that he was the Messiah of Israel was to this woman. What a contrast to what David did. So why did David do it? I think the reason's obvious. I can't be sure. The king doesn't want his wife living with a commoner, with somebody else. That's a shame for the king, for his wife to be living with someone else. So he demanded that she be brought. If he's going to be king of Israel, then he wanted all his wives there. So he destroyed that relationship. He destroyed the relationship with Paltiel, I believe, out of pride. Then we read 2 Samuel 6. The ark of the Lord was entering the city of David, and Michal, the daughter of Saul, watched from a window. And when she saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord, she despised him in her heart. I think she despised him long before this. When David returned home to bless his household, Michal, daughter of Saul, came out to meet him and said, how the king of Israel has distinguished himself today, going around half naked in full view of the slave girls of his servants, as any vulgar fellow would. David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me rather than your father or anyone from his house when he appointed me ruler over the Lord's people of Israel. I will celebrate before the Lord. I'll become even more undignified than this. I will be humiliated in your eyes, but by the slave girls you spoke of, I will be held in honour. His answer to her was, God picked me over your family. Did she ever raise that? Did Michal ever bring that up in the conversation? Did she ever say, it should have been my father's family that was ruling Israel? Never. It was David who brought it up in the most hurtful way he could, sticking the knife in and twisting it. Your family was booted out, I took over. She never said that. And then he says, well, let me put this in a modern context. Imagine a husband and wife is having a tiff and having words with each other. And the husband says, well, you mightn't like me, but all the girls at the office do. How's that going to work for you? That's what David said. All the slave girls love him. Was that said to build the relationship? It was said out of just meanness. said that Michael had no children to her death, and some people have interpreted that as a curse on her, that God would not allow her to have children because of what she had done. I don't believe that's true. The answer is very simple. They never had an intimate relationship again. They never slept together again. That's why she had no children. So what are we left with? We're left with a story which has no tenderness, no gentleness. What could have happened? Imagine how different the story had been if Michael had said, "Look, David, you made a fool of yourself today." What if David had turned to her and said, "Michael, you are the wife of my youth. You are my first wife. From you I have no secrets. But I must worship God first. God must come first. And if I put other relationships at jeopardy because of that, then so it must be. But Michael, come with me. Hold my hand and come worship God together. Let's go on this journey together." And perhaps she could have been saved. But there was no decency in what David said. It was designed to hurt. And the fruit of the Spirit was not there. The gentleness and the kindness. Let's come to a New Testament example. The split between Paul and Barnabas. Do you know what Barnabas means? Any Bible you look at will say son of encouragement or the son of consolation. That's not what it means at all. I don't know why it says that. The word Barnabas means son of rest. Yeah, sounds good to me. I'm always ready for a rest and a bit of a snooze. But it would probably also mean to me son of tranquility, a tranquil person. That was not his name. That was his nickname. We read his name was actually Joseph. And Joseph, who was also named Barnabas by the apostles, which translated means son of encouragement or consolation, etc., and then it goes on. It was his nickname. Why do you think they would have nicknamed a man son of tranquility or son of consolation or son of encouragement? Did he sound like a firebrand, ready for a fight? I don't think so. I think he would have been a very kind and gentle person. Acts 15. But Paul insisted, it was Paul who insisted, that they should not take with them one who had departed from them in Pamphylia and had not gone with them to the work. And the contention became so sharp that they parted one from another. So Barnabas took Mark and sailed to Cyprus. They split up. Barnabas went off with John Mark, and then Paul went off with Silas. But I just get the feeling that the thing that's sad in there is that the contention became so sharp. It didn't have to be. They could have decided to go their separate ways. They could have said to each other, "Look, it's really going to be a worry to me if we take John Mark with us, so why don't we go separately? I'll take Silas and you take John, and let's pray that both our ventures work out for the Lord." It doesn't seem like that. It seems as though the contention was probably born out of a lack of gentleness. And so they split. We get a slight hint. I don't often see Paul saying he was wrong, but I think we get a hint. When in the very last chapter written of the 2 Timothy, when he is about to die, the last letter that Paul wrote, the last words, he says, "Send John Mark to me because he's beneficial to me. Send the one that I wouldn't travel with, the one that I refuse to take. Send him to me because he's valuable." That's as close, I think, as you'll get an admission from Paul that he might have made a mistake. But again, it was the lack of this gentleness that mattered. Then I want to take the last example, which is a rather odd one, and it's from our readings. We've been going through Jeremiah. And I want to have a look at, this time, a positive example of care and gentleness beyond what was needed. Jeremiah chapter 38, there was an Ethiopian called Ebed-Melek, And I think we probably come across in the Bible many times when people are great servants of God when they were converts. They were not born into Israel. I think Israel always suffered and still do from this concept that they are God's chosen people. You know, John the Baptist said God can make children of Israel or children of Abraham out of the stones on the side of the road. It means nothing. And often those people who came in as converts had a better understanding than the children of Israel. And so this Ethiopian went to the king and said, "Do you know that all these guys have put Jeremiah into the slime pit? They've dropped into this pit just full of slime." And the king said, "Well, quick, go and get him out." Now, all that was told to this Ethiopian was to get Jeremiah out of the slime pit. But what he did went one step beyond. All he needed to do was throw a loop of rope down and Jeremiah could put his arms through and pull him up. But this is what he said: "Please put these old clothes and rags under your armpits and under the ropes." And Jeremiah did so. Just a tiny bit of kindness. Throw down some old rags, put them under your arms so the rope doesn't hurt. That's just kindness that goes beyond what he's commanded to do. It also is interesting, I don't know whether you remember reading the King James Version in the old days when you were in Sunday school or whatever like that. This verse said that he threw down old cast clouts. And for years I thought, what on earth is a cast clout? Well, now I know. It's old used rags and clothes. So that's what he put under it. Just unasked kindness. And then we come to Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard of the Babylonians. When the commander of the guard found Jeremiah, he said to him, "The Lord your God decreed this disaster for this place, and now the Lord has brought it about, has done just as he said he would. All this happened because your people sinned against the Lord and did not obey him. But today I am freeing you from the chains on your wrists." Because he was still in jail, even though he'd been dragged out of the pit. "Come with me to Babylon, if you like, and I will look after you. But if you do not want to, then don't come. Look, the whole country lies before you. Go wherever you please." However, before Jeremiah turned to go, Nebuzaradan said, "Go back to Gedaliah, whom the king of Babylon has appointed over the towns of Judah, and live with him among the people, and go anywhere else you please." That was more than what Nebuchadnezzar had actually asked. Nebuchadnezzar had said, "Free Jeremiah." But this was an important man. He said, "If you want to, come back with the captives, come back to Babylon." He had known that Jeremiah had told the people to go to Babylon. He said, "Come back." But what did he say then? "I will look after you." This man would have been close to being second, third, fourth in charge in the kingdom. In those days, the soldiers were politicians as well. He would have been right near the top of the kingdom. He offered his protection to Jeremiah. "Come back and stay with me." Or, he said, if not, go and stay with the governor of Judea. That's the next best thing. Then in chapter 39, verse 11, "Now Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, gave charge concerning Jeremiah to Nebuzaradan, the captain of the guard, saying, 'Take him and look after him. Do him no harm, but do to him just as he says to you.' And so they gave him the charge of the governor of Judea. Just kindness. Unnecessary kindness. All they needed to do was to free Jeremiah. And you might wonder, how did Nebuchadnezzar even know about Jeremiah? How did Nebuchadnezzar send a message from Babylon to look after this prophet? Well, I'm not great on the timelines, but as far as I know, Daniel is already back in Babylon. Daniel's already been interacting with Nebuchadnezzar. And Shadrach, Meshach and Abednego have also been interacting with Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar knows about the God of Israel now. And he knows of what Jeremiah's been saying. because Daniel's been reading the prophet Jeremiah. And that's how Daniel determined the 70 years for Babylon. So the king of Babylon knew. And what was he to do about it? He and his captain of the guard was to do everything they could to be kind to Jeremiah. And so, all I would say is that we ought to follow in those steps. Look at what Paul wrote. I haven't mentioned the symbols in front of us. The greatest symbol of kindness and gentleness. Jesus, who took little children and reprimanded his disciples when they said, don't bother to talk to the children. Jesus, who took the time to speak to Peter and say, do you love me? After all that Peter had done, the way that Peter turned his back on him. And yet Jesus had forgiven all of that, and in gentleness said to him, feed my sheep. And it's something that I think every one of us can take to heart. As I said, I can think of many occasions in my own life when I have not been as gentle as I could have been. And so for every one of us, the message today epitomised in Jesus Christ, who was the very symbol of gentleness, is that in our interactions, particularly with each other, be gentle, be kind and be loving.